The silence in the room was as heavy as the late afternoon air. Dust motes danced in the lone sunbeam slicing through the living room window, a slow, hypnotic ballet. For Sarah, a woman whose life had settled into a comfortable, predictable rhythm, this quiet was a luxury. Her days were a familiar pattern of managing her small antique shop, sharing a laugh with her husband, Mark, over dinner, and ending the night with a cup of chamomile tea and the nightly news. It was a life that, on the surface, held no surprises, no jarring notes. But sometimes, a single, unexpected chord can shatter an entire symphony. Tonight, that chord wasn't a sound, but an image. As the local news anchor began her report on a recent missing person case, a photograph flashed on the screen. Sarah's teacup, halfway to her lips, stopped dead. The woman in the grainy, slightly overexposed photo was smiling, her eyes crinkling at the corners in a familiar way. A shock, cold and sharp, jolted through Sarah's body, causing a tremor to run down her arm. The teacup clattered against its saucer, spilling a few drops of the warm liquid onto the mahogany table. "Mark," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Look." Mark, engrossed in his book, glanced up, a soft smile on his face. "What is it, honey? Did you see something interesting?" "The news," she repeated, her voice a little louder now, laced with an urgency he couldn't miss. "The woman on the news. I know her." He set his book down and turned his attention to the television. The anchor was now detailing the case. A woman named Lena Petrova, 58 years old, had vanished from her home in a quiet suburb of Detroit. The last person to see her was her neighbor, who reported seeing her leave for her morning walk 2 days ago. Typical, heartbreaking story. But as Mark looked at the photo, his own smile faded. He didn't know the woman, but he knew the eyes, and the way her reddish-brown hair was styled, a little out of date, but meticulously cared for. He knew the small, almost imperceptible scar above her left eyebrow, a childhood injury from a fall from a bike. "Sarah," he said, his voice now a mirror of her own disbelief. That's your Aunt Clara." The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible. Sarah's Aunt Clara had been missing for over 30 years. She had vanished without a trace when Sarah was a teenager, a ghost story that haunted her family's history. The police had searched, but Clara's life had been a series of closed doors, a mystery even to her own sister, Sarah's mother. There was no body, no note, no explanation, just a void that swallowed a vibrant, enigmatic woman. For 3 decades, Sarah and her family had grappled with the silence. They had moved through the stages of grief, eventually settling on a weary acceptance. Aunt Clara was gone, but now here she was, a woman named Lena Petrova, a woman with a different life, a different name, and yet the same face. A new wave of memories, long buried under the weight of time, surged to the surface. Memories of a young Clara, wild and free-spirited, telling stories with a mischievous twinkle in her eye. Memories of her laugh, a melody that could fill a room, and a chilling, long-forgotten memory of the last time Sarah saw her. A quiet argument with her mother, hushed tones, and a look of desperation in Clara's eyes that Sarah, at the time, hadn't understood. The phone rang, shattering the fragile moment. It was Sarah's sister, Jessica, her voice frantic. "Sarah, are you watching the news? Did you see? Can't be, can it? Aunt Clara, I saw her, but they called her Lena. What does it all mean?" The impossible had become possible. The unexplainable suddenly had a face. This wasn't a reunion. It was a riddle, a cruel twist of fate that had resurrected a ghost, not to offer closure, but to open a new, more terrifying chapter. They were no longer mourning a loss. They were facing a deception of monumental proportions. The woman on the news looked just like her missing aunt, but the truth they were about to discover was a far more complex and dangerous thing. The next few days were a blur of frantic phone calls, grainy screenshots, and the unsettling feeling of living in a dream. The news story, which had been a passing segment on a local broadcast, now felt like the single most important thing in their world. Every new detail about Lena Petrova was a new puzzle piece, a new layer of a life that was both foreign and hauntingly familiar. They learned she was a retired librarian, a widow, and a pillar of her community. She was known for her kindness, her love of gardening, and her volunteer work at the local animal shelter. It was the life of a woman who had found her peace. But it wasn't Clara's life. Clara, as Sarah remembered, was a free spirit who lived life on her own terms. She was an artist, a dreamer who had never been one for quiet domesticity. The idea of her as a retired librarian, a woman tending to roses, felt like a cruel joke. Yet, every picture they found of Lena Petrova, from old school photos to recent snapshots from neighborhood gatherings, showed the same face, the same distinctive mole on her chin, the same intense, intelligent eyes. Mark, ever the pragmatist, had plunged into the details, creating a timeline of Lena Petrova's life. He found birth records, marriage licenses, and even a death certificate for her husband. The paperwork was flawless. Lena Petrova was, by all accounts, a real person. But how could she be? How could two people, separated by 3 decades and a continent of lies, share the same face? The logical part of Mark's brain rebelled. There had to be a rational explanation, a doppelganger, a genetic anomaly. But the emotional, gut-wrenching certainty in Sarah's eyes told him otherwise. Sarah, meanwhile, was on a different mission. She started digging into their family's past, pulling out old photo albums and dusty boxes of letters. She found faded pictures of Clara as a teenager, her mischievous smile a carbon copy of Lena's. She found letters from Clara to her mother, filled with dreams of travel and art, and a simmering discontent with the quiet, conventional life her family wanted for her. Then she found something else. A letter, tucked away at the bottom of a box, postmarked a few months before Clara vanished. The handwriting was different, shaky and hurried. It wasn't from Clara, but from a friend of hers, a woman named Eleanor. The letter was short, but its content was chilling. It spoke of a secret, a man, and a desperate plea for help. "Clara is in trouble, Margaret," it read. "She's gotten herself tangled up with someone dangerous. I've tried to warn her, but she won't listen. Please talk to her before it's too late." Sarah's mother, Margaret, had always been a private woman, and she had never mentioned this letter. Was this the secret argument Sarah had overheard? The look of desperation in Clara's eyes? Had Clara not run away, but run to something? Or, more terrifyingly, from something? The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but they formed a picture not of a happy, rediscovered relative, but of a woman living a lie. The life of Lena Petrova was a carefully constructed fortress, a shell built to hide a truth so profound and so dangerous that it had required Clara to erase her own existence. What had she done? Who had she been running from? And was that person still out there, now that she had, once again, disappeared? The disappearance of Lena Petrova, a woman who had lived a quiet, seemingly unremarkable life, was no longer just a missing person case. It was a second act in a decades-old drama, a tragic encore. The woman on the news looked just like her missing aunt, but the real mystery wasn't her identity. It was the question of what or who had forced her to create a new one, and whether her old life had finally caught up to her. The trail, as they soon discovered, was not only cold but meticulously scrubbed clean. Every lead they tried to follow on Lena Petrova seemed to hit a dead end, a meticulously constructed wall of normalcy. The police, of course, were not interested in Sarah's outlandish theory. They had Lena's birth certificate, her social security number, her entire life story documented and filed. To them, Sarah was just a grief-stricken woman clinging to a long-dead past. They had bigger fish to fry. But Sarah knew better. The scar, the eyes, the smile. No one could convince her otherwise. Fueled by a cocktail of desperation and a rekindled sense of familial duty, Sarah and Mark took matters into their own hands. They traveled to Detroit, to the quiet suburb where Lena Petrova had lived. The neighborhood was exactly as described. Manicured lawns, 2-story houses, and a palpable sense of peace. It was the perfect place for a ghost to hide. They spoke to Lena's neighbors, kind-hearted people who spoke of her with great affection. A woman named Carol, who lived across the street, described Lena as a saint, a woman who was always there to lend a hand, to bring a casserole to a new family, to offer a kind word. She showed them photos of Lena at neighborhood barbecues, her face a mask of serene contentment, a mask that, to Sarah, looked eerily like a prison. One detail, however, stood out. A man named Arthur, a retired mailman, mentioned a strange incident a few weeks before Lena's disappearance. A car, a sleek, black sedan with tinted windows, had been parked on the street for 2 days, just sitting there. He said it gave him a funny feeling. He'd seen a man, tall and slender, with a dark hat, get out once and just stare at Lena's house. Arthur, being a curious man, had asked him if he needed help, and the man had just gotten back into the car without a word and driven off. A few days later, the car was gone. Sarah's blood ran cold. Was this the ghost from Clara's past, finally catching up? Sarah and Mark also managed to get in touch with Eleanor, the friend who had written the letter. Now an elderly woman living in a nursing home, Eleanor's memory was a fragile, scattered thing. But when Sarah mentioned Clara, a flicker of recognition, a spark of fear, came into her eyes. "He was a bad man," she whispered, her voice frail. "A very bad man. He was with the wrong people. And Clara, she saw something she shouldn't have seen." Eleanor's memory was too fragmented to provide more details, but she did recall one final, chilling piece of information. The man's name was something strange, something to do with a bird. "I think it was Raven or Rook." Rook. The name was a key, a single word that could unlock a 30-year-old secret. Sarah felt a surge of fear, but also a fierce determination. She had found a name, a lead, a face to the faceless threat that had stolen her aunt and forced her to become someone else. The woman on the news looked just like her missing aunt, but the truth was a web of deceit and danger, and they were now standing directly in its center, the threads of the past tightening around them. The name Rook proved to be the key that unlocked a door they had long thought sealed shut. With some careful digging, Mark discovered a network of organized crime from the 1980s, a group that had operated in the very city Clara had lived in. One of the lieutenants, a man named Marcus Rookvander, had been known for his ruthlessness and his uncanny ability to make people disappear. He had been a low-profile operator, never a flashy mob boss, but a quiet, efficient killer. He had vanished himself in the late 90s, presumed dead, but his file was thick with unsolved disappearances. The final, heartbreaking piece of the puzzle came from an old newspaper article. It wasn't about a crime, but about a fire. A house fire, in a quiet part of town, that had claimed the lives of a young couple and their infant child. The date was a few months after Clara's disappearance. The names of the victims were Thomas and Laura Miller. But a small detail in the article, a single sentence, caught Sarah's eye. A neighbor, a young artist named Clara, was said to have been a close friend of the couple and was last seen talking to them just hours before the fire. It all clicked. Clara hadn't run away. She had been a witness. She had seen something related to Thomas and Laura Miller, something so dangerous that it had forced her to flee, to erase her entire identity and create a new life. Rook had been responsible for their deaths, and Clara, the girl who had seen too much, had become his next target. He hadn't found her then, but had he found her now? The police, armed with this new information, finally took Sarah's theory seriously. They revisited the case of Lena Petrova, not as a missing person, but as a potential victim of a decades-old crime. They found a few things they had initially missed. A strange, almost imperceptible scratch on the door frame of Lena's house, as if someone had tried to jimmy the lock, and a small, nearly invisible tracking device found on the underside of her car. Lena Petrova, they concluded, had been a woman living in constant fear. The kind of fear that makes you live a different life in a different city under a different name. The car, the man in the dark hat, it had been him. Rook, or one of his associates, had found her. The disappearance of Lena Petrova wasn't a mystery. It was a kidnapping. The story was still unfolding. The search for Lena/Clara was now a high priority, multi-state manhunt. The ending wasn't neat or happy. They didn't find Clara, at least not yet. But the truth, the dark, horrifying truth, was out. The woman on the news looked just like her missing aunt. But she wasn't just a face on a screen. She was a living, breathing testament to a past that never stays buried. A testament to the lies we live and the shadows we run from. And that's where her story ends for now. The woman on the news. The woman who became a ghost. What do you think happened to her? Let me know in the comments below. And if you're as fascinated by these stories as I am, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into the unexplained.